Hey, what's up everyone? I'm Magrann and I'm a queer cyborg game designer living in Columbus, Ohio. Please click the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe if you'd like to keep up to date on all of the content I'm putting out every few days. And today I'm going to talk to you about how my gender identity affects my game design, and maybe about how it affects yours too. So what even is my gender identity? You know, I currently identify as queer, gender fluid, hard femme, trans, non-binary, and I go by she, her pronouns, but they and them is okay too. I just don't really like the sound of they, them personally, although it's totally fine for other people, of course. And it's always shifting, my gender. I've always liked ideas of transformation. I have like 5 tattoos about transformation on me. And I've always liked it when, or identified with characters who go through a major transformation in their life. And, I recently identified on the internet as a cyborg. I don't know, it's kind of silly, but also kind of feels like a good gender identity for me. Like, cyborgs are very much about transformation. They're able to switch genders or body parts, right? Which is something that I like to do in reality. And I've always loved, ever since I read it, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. If you haven't read it, look it up online. It's all online for free. It's only like, I don't know, 20 pages. It is academic. She talks about the cyborg being like a complex identity with no binaries and with many moving parts. And so that really spoke to me when it came to thinking about my gender identity as relating to the cyborg metaphor. This took me a long time to figure out. I have always known how I felt about my gender, but I wasn't sure how to express it to other people or talk about it in English words. So usually the identifier I use now, within maybe like the past year, is non-binary. That's the big one. Because it has gained so much popularity, people now know what it is. If I say it very easily, I don't have to say queer or gender fluid, I can say non-binary. Although all those words that I used at the beginning are a little bit more accurate to my gender identity. I'm currently cosplaying K-Stu in Personal Shopper. Got the hat, the black shirt, scary ghosty eyes. If you haven't seen Personal Shopper, it was pretty great. I loved it. It's a sad ghost story, which I love sad ghost stories. Which, kind of leads me into my next topic, which is that when I first started playing role-playing games, I was drawn to Vampire, the Masquerade, Vampire the tabletop role-playing game, because I was a goth kid and I loved vampires. But there's more gendered stuff hiding in there with vampire fiction. Vampire fiction is often feminine coded. If you look at Dracula, the story is about, a monster romancing a lady or a lady falling in love with and marrying a monster. So, there is a historical record of women doing this. And there's a recent awesome breakdown of it by a YouTuber I love, Lindsay Ellis, who creates these amazing videos on YouTube that break down different genre movies. And she recently talked about The Shape of Water and the history in film of women loving monsters and kind of how that goes. She breaks down a lot of the sexism and tropes, and it's excellent. It's also queer monster romance, right? And when I say queer, I don't necessarily mean gay, although there is a lot of queer coding in monster romances, because basically it's the metaphor of queers feeling monstrous. Like, we feel as though we're weirdos or outsiders, and so we identify with the monster. Or being portrayed as monstrous by the status quo. Like, often monsters have queer coding. Like I talked about Disney in my last video. often making their villains have queer coding, you know, because queers are the bad guys to the status quo. And also just being unsure about our monstrous bodies, our how our bodies feel to us, how we feel in our bodies, is very similar to how we might identify with how monsters feel. So all that stuff is in there too. So basically, if it wasn't for Vampire the Masquerade, the role-playing game, I probably wouldn't be playing role-playing games. And these experiences with role-playing games that I played informed how I want to design. So I learned during play, you know, over the course of 15 years of playing different role-playing games, just starting with Vampire, you know, that I prefer story to strategy in role-playing games. So I still enjoy strategy in other games, you know, board games, video games, card games, but I prefer for my role-playing games to be story-focused. And I learned that I prefer character development to violence. I would much rather tell the story of a character developing through play than role play out a whole bunch of scenes of sequential violence. And I prefer games that have representation of me and my subcultures in the game. So, you know, queers, women, punks, goths, cyberpunks, or any kind of sci-fi or horror is stuff that I have preferences for. So how does this relate to my gender identity? If I can focus on story, then I can tell stories that relate to me and people like me, instead of focusing on strategy, which is often in the form of fighting, battle, or some kind of physical violence in the game, which isn't to say that, you know, people with my gender identity haven't always been fighting in wars and in physical violence. It's just that I prefer stories that don't focus on that as much when it comes to the mechanics and the storytelling in the game. I mean, I love stories about badasses, like, you know, Major Motoko Kusanagi from Ghost in the Shell is one of my favorite characters of all time. And I love the power fantasy of role-playing a physical badass, but in today's political climate, I feel like it's a little regressive. If I can focus on character development, then I can talk about characters who are going through similar identity changes or feelings, like I always am. So, you know, I can talk about how they're dealing with their identities, how it can inform my identity, or help other people learn about theirs. It takes a lot of people a lot of time to figure out their queer identities, and the main reason for that is that there's just not much support. And I'm talking about the US, but it is a somewhat global issue where, you know, we are so outside of the status quo that we don't have as many role models. We don't have as many people in our family or friends or cultures to look up to or to help guide us through what being queer looks like, or what you do. So basically, if I can create a game that helps people identify earlier that these are things like them, I mean, any tool is a good tool. And if I can represent people like me, then other people might find themselves in my games, just like I find myself in gosh darn Vampire. And not D&D, right? It was the genre category, it was horror, it was my subculture, it was something that was, you know, to my teenage mind, more welcoming to weird identities, strange people, you know, strange outside the status quo, queer people, women and femmes. And so all of that is what drew me into role-playing games. Vampire. You tricky jerk. You're not really a jerk. I'm sorry. I love you, Vampire. Even though you're not the best game, you will always be in my dark heart. So basically having an understanding of my gender identity, learning how I kind of found related things within different games that I liked that allowed me to express my gender identity and who I am while I'm role-playing, allowed me to then understand what I wanted to include in my designs, in my game designs, and therefore share with the rest of the world. So that's pretty much how my gender informs my design in a very simple, straightforward video. It's way more complicated than that, and I will probably do more follow-ups on this video. Thank you so much for watching. You are lovely. If you like my videos, remember to like and subscribe, and check out my Patreon where you can support me making these videos and designing experimental analog games, queer games, you know, feminine games, stuff like that I talked about in this video. And check out my new game, A Cozy Den, which is a queer game about lesbian snakes. And you'll probably like it if you like all the stuff I just talked about. So that's it for now. See you next video. I was weirdly like nervous making this video. I think it's just like hard to talk about your gender identity and how it makes you feel and creating your art and what that's about. It's just very personal, vulnerable, you know, stuff. So thanks for listening, and I hope that maybe it can give you some insight into your designs and how your gender affects your designs as well. And I'd love to know how your gender affects your role-playing, your taste in role-playing games, or your game design. Tell me down below in the comments.